These are the updated academic template directions. And so what we're going to first look at is the requirement, and you want to make sure that you hit the 12 sentence minimum. This is telling you what you should be doing with each particular section breakdown. For example, for the thesis, you want to have one sentence. You're outlining your argument, and then the context. You don't want to give me your thesis, which needs to be underlined, and then go into source one. No, you need to provide context, and context is going to be background information about your topic. And you want to have at least 2 sentences for this. Then you're going to identify source one. Keep in mind, when you identify source one, you want to introduce the author or the name of the source that you are using. And then the source must support the thesis. If it does not support the thesis, the source will not count. If your thesis, you are telling me you're writing about cats and this source is about dogs, you are going to get this wrong. After you introduce source one, you then need to analyze. The way you want to analyze is you want to answer 1 or 2 questions. How does this source support the thesis? Why are you including it in your essay? The answer to that question should help develop your analysis, which then helps develop and support that thesis. Then you're going to have to do this 2 more times. You want to identify source 2 and then repeat this process once again. Then you're going to identify source 3, and then you are going to, hopefully at that point, be done supporting this particular thesis. We look down here, the only sources that are allowed are going to be JSTOR articles, New York Times articles from the time period you are writing about, or you can use primary source documents. You cannot use any information from PowerPoints or lectures. You need to use JSTOR or primary sources. As we look at this slide, it's just a recap. You want to make sure that you hit the sentence minimum, and you want to use this as your template. When we're looking at the thesis, you want to have that 1 sentence long, and it has to be underlined. And then here we have some information about the context. You want to provide background information and details about the event prior to the issue. So if you are writing about credit in the 1920s, maybe you want to spend some time writing about the spending, some of the issues that were going on in the early 1920s. And maybe you can write about how people felt with regard to paying with cash as opposed to paying with credit. And then you want to get into the source. Keep in mind, each source you are scored. So if you do not support the thesis with a credible source and have the correct analysis, you run the risk of getting a -3 deduction 3 times, 1 for source 1, 2, and 3. We have some additional deductions here. Flow, basically what I'm looking for is essay clarity. You don't want to have sentences that just kind of abruptly stop. World War I, many people argued, was a devastating conflict. Okay, well, number 1, we want to get rid of many people. Number 2, you probably want to provide some examples exactly what you're talking about. Assumptions. Do not assume the reader knows what you are talking about, especially in a scenario that could potentially be one where you don't quite support the thesis. So for example, if you are writing about cats and for some reason you are going to make some weird connection between cats and dogs, you better make that connection clear. Otherwise, you're making some sort of assumption. Writing too much, basically what I'm looking for here is to be real quick. Give me that thesis, give me your first source, and do not provide too much background information. If you start giving me a summary about every little aspect of the Roaring Twenties, you are probably writing too much. I can easily pick up on filler information. All I want to know is your thesis, your support for your thesis, and your analysis. Not historic. This basically is an opinion piece. Maybe the individual writes something about terrorism, Andrew Kehoe in the 1920s with the school bathhouse bombing, and then for some reason you start rambling on about 9/11. I would see no connection between the two. Does not appear to be historic, and also seems to be off topic as well. Accuracy is just about providing incorrect information. Once again, too much summary of events. You want to be concise. Just give me your thesis and support the thesis. Every source, everything you should be writing should have one objective, supporting the thesis. Vague, dates, names, and specific acts are missing. You start writing about terrorism and 9/11, which by the way would be wrong anyway because there's a disconnect between those two. But let's just say you are writing about them. Well, I would expect some dates, some names, and specific acts that are linking those two. As I'm reading, I'm looking for reader difficulty. I start with that thesis. I read source 1 and then your analysis. If it doesn't make sense to me, I then go back and reread that thesis. And then I do this after I read source 2 and source 3 with the analysis. I should be able to go back to the thesis, read it, and then in my head answer the question, did the student support the thesis? If they did not, and I have to look at like source 1 and I go back to source 3 and I'm trying to go back to the thesis, this is just way too difficult for the reader, which means you're probably going to get hit with this deduction. Source length. You do not want to have a massive paragraph for your source. The source should be about 2 sentences, 3 sentences, the most. At the end of the essay, I'm going to ask the question, did the student support the thesis? Am I convinced about their overall argument? And if I'm not, that right there could lead to a deduction. Source alignment, again, it's looking at whether or not that thesis and those sources match up. If they don't, that is an issue. Here we have a sample. Student is writing, Germany started World War I because she threatened Belgium, declared war on Russia, and issued a blank check. This is the thesis. So many times students then jump right into their first source. That would be wrong. This is the context where they're providing some background information about what they're writing about before they transition to the thesis. So here you have the introduction using German request for free pass through Belgium, which is a primary source document. Here they are citing the source, and then this section right here is their analysis. And then remember, you have to do this for source 2 and source 3. Here we see a sample paper. Notice how the margins on both sides are straight down, which is justified margins. They have the underlying thesis. They have their name, block, and all of that information there. Here we have that context. Here we have that thesis. And then they have footnotes at the end. There's also in the directions guidelines with regard to footnotes, the sources you should be citing. Do not ask questions in the essay. Do not write in present or past tense. And then for those of you looking at footnotes, this is the way you structure the footnotes for the bottom of the page, and then at the end for your works cited bibliography. You can also think about this hamburger method. It's basically how the rubric is set up. You're going to have your source and then your thoughts on how the source supports your writing. So that's basically the hamburger method, where you are, enclosing your source and your analysis. That is basically this section right here, the meat. Always include a hard copy of the sources you use. What does that mean? That means in your essay, if right here you cited page 12 of whatever source, I expect to see page 12 of that source, and then the section underlined. The section underlined should be the same section cited in your paper.